So, what is light? Well, it's a light, but why does it work the way it does? There. This is an egg. Our light source is coming from. Oh, let me get another layer. Our light source is coming from this direction, which is our core light. I guess it would be. Yeah, our core light is from this direction. So our light source is over here. Boop, boop, boop. And this area here where the light is, that would be our core light. Then this shaded area is our halftone. This is when the light source main view starts to fade out and not all the light hits it. The terminator is what I talked about as usually your center line, where the light, the change in planes is away from the light, so it's not hitting it directly. Your core shadow is where the light can't reach easily. Since our light is over here, this is the farthest point away from the light source. Our bounce light is when the light bounces and hits the surface and comes back and hits usually like you take this and flip it in the direction, like, hold on, like I would take this, because this is the part that's lit, duplicate the shape, transform it, and then this is where bounce light would happen, and that's why the core shadow is here, because light wouldn't really bounce up to this point. That's how bounce light works. It's basically a reflection of what was bounced off the object, hitting another object, and then bouncing back. It's complicated, but not really. If you start thinking about it like this, you have to remember, it's kind of like if you ever played billiards or pool. Like if you hit the ball and it bounces off, it'll ricochet and go. That's how light works. It goes boom. Then it might hit this thing and then go boom and back up. Kinda. Like your light would hit it, bounce, hit something else, hit the floor and bounce right back up. That's your bounce light, in a sense. And it's always weaker than your light source, because every time it hits something, it gets weaker. So always keep that in mind. Like, every time light hits something, the light loses a part of its energy. Then you have your cast shadow, which is this darker part. And then your occlusion shadow is where the light isn't getting in anymore. Because even shadows have their, like, bounce. And your highlight is here, which I explained earlier. It is basically you're we are here. We are viewing it from this angle, and the light's over here. So it would be basically how light works. But this is the reflection of the light source. So you put it in the viewer's perspective. Like, you could paint this out and move it up here. And nobody would really call you out on it, because this moves. We'll talk about this later. The highlight can move based on the camera angle, and the rotation of the object. It's not always here in this zone. We'll cover that right now. Your core light is here, and your highlight is here, because the viewer is here. It is like the middle point between your light source and the viewer, if you would ricochet it. On this rotation, the highlight would be here because the core light is here, and it would ricochet here and then bounce back to the viewer. And usually, the closer it is to your core light, the sharper your shadows are. The smaller your shadows are, because your core light is like in front in the viewer's perspective. And if your core light is like behind, then your highlight would still be over here, but in your halftones, and your shadow would be big. So your highlight placement all depends on the direction of your light source and the angle the viewer is looking at it. So your camera angle that you choose to draw in. So it's important to establish where your light source is when you start doing shading and stuff, because even the direction will affect how you go about shading it, based on rotation, or just that's how the highlight works. That's how you can figure out where to put it. It doesn't have to be perfect, as I said. It's any questions on like basic lighting fundamentals? We'll go into other stuff, and I can do another sample of Spear if you want. I basically practice this fundamental. Anybody else? I know Anna's good, but don't be shy. If not, I'll move on to this part, which is how to think okay, Bridge. See ya, I am recording this, so it'll be up on my YouTube channel then, that you can rewatch it if you miss it. Rewatch what you miss and stuff. See ya, Bryce. I can't, I'll just call you Bryce. Next thing is to start thinking of stuff in planes. These two objects have the exact same lighting source and they are shaded the exact same way. The only difference between a smooth object and a more flat object is more planes. This won't be perfect, but you'll get the idea. But yeah, it's the same object, and then if you cut this in half, and this in half, and this in half, and this in half, and this, basically this object is just a lot of planes to make it look smooth. But you should be thinking about forms in this way. It'll make it easier to plan your shading. Like if we break down, I know my light source is here. So my plane, in my head, I have a plane here. And then it curves around here. And then I have another plane about here. I have this curving. My edges could have been a bit better on this. That's why if you watch me stream sometimes when I'm sketching stuff out, you'll see me actually draw these squares. That's me trying to figure out not only the 3D space, but plan out where my shadows would hit. Because my light source is from here, this thing. That's why my highlights here, because this is opposite light. Here's where my core shadow is. This might be blocked by the light, but it's ricocheting off and getting other bounce light. It's underwater, so light fades. It's bouncing through water too, so it just naturally fades. But you get the point. Don't think of these smooth surfaces. Think about what the plane directions are. Like if we have a muscle, a typical like shoulder, you got your center. This is a bad muscle, very simple. But you would have planes here, planes here, and then this is how you should start thinking about shapes. because this will let you plan your light a lot better. So your light source, we'll say it's coming from this side, would be here. Your mid-tone would be, mid-tone would be on this side. That's too light. I don't like that. There you go. And probably darken it a bit here, because this is where the light would not reach. I always want to call it the equator, but it's your terminator. Soften this edge. So this will be a bit darker. Oops. We'll make this the terminator color, and then... Why is that so dark? There you go. Then you'd have your cast shadow within this crevice, because, well, your cast shadow, it's more like the light can't get within this muscle area right here. And your core shadow would be right about here. And soften these edges a bit. So put my brush size up. Get my cast shadow in. Bounce light. You would polish this up, but basically that's how you would go about planning your lighting. And eventually you won't have to draw these lines. You'll just see them in your head and understand them. You want to start thinking of forms in terms of planes. Like I said, these two spheres are the exact same thing. Yeah. Edit, cut. The only difference between this and this is it has more planes making it up. It's like a low poly versus high poly 3D model. That's how you should think as an artist. You want to plan your drawings as their low poly models, probably not as low poly as you would think, but this is about good. Like what I did. And then you can use that to base your, like if I was going to cell shade this, I would probably put my cell shading right here. Cell shading doesn't use bounce light. It's kind of part of the style. But cell shading does often use core shadows. Like, you see a lot of artists that do cel shaded work, be that anime or manga or just fan art, or Pokemon uses two-tone shading too. Your deeper shadows are usually a darker tone. Oh, like that. There we go. Your highlight would be right about here. Put that highlight right about here. As you see, that still follows our planes and rules. Doesn't matter what type of, if you're doing flat shading or blended or anything, you always want to know how light works, because that will determine where to actually place your shadows. Understanding light and the direction, keeping it consistent throughout your piece is also very important. Like, always keeping in mind, okay, where is my light source? Even drawing something in the corner to remind you, like, my light source is coming from up here. This is where I usually put my light. I like to paint either from top left, usually a bit from the back. Like, if I had a sphere, my light would be over here, but I usually put mine slightly behind the character, but up high to the top left. Other people put it wherever, like, but for general practice, this is where I put it. But if I have an actual light source, like a sun in my back, then I take it in consideration. Always understand where your light source is. If you have a fire, like, or if there's a magic spell, one of your light sources would be that spell, and you'd have to determine how strong that is. Oh, my pen didn't stopped. Hold on. Here, okay. Oh, come on. Stop messing up. Okay. Let's go. Does that make sense? Thinking in planes and using that to plan your shading? Any questions on that aspect of understanding light and how to go about it? Next thing is, this is more of a value thing, but it's lighting, but we'll put these here. Basically, the closer to an object is to the horizon, which is where your light usually is, like your natural light source, the sun, it's lighter. And the further away it is, it's darker. This is your values. You have your, I'm going to pronounce this wrong. I'm going to spell this wrong. Foreground, which is these darker tones. This is your foreground. Usually, this is way too bright, but I didn't really care too much for this. Your foreground is like, oops, wrong color. Here, like anything that's like in front of the viewer. Like if I put a tree here, this would be a foreground object. It is technically in front of all these lighter values because it's but because it's up close, it is blocking the light from reaching the viewer, so it is darker. It is a foreground object. It is just not, even if it's well lit, it would naturally look darker than the stuff that is back here. So you would go back a bit, and then everything would get lighter. You go back further, and it does it again, and again, and eventually you just wouldn't even be able to tell the objects apart real well. So things get smaller and lighter as they go away. A lot of people don't realize that things get lighter. They blend into whatever your horizon color is. If it's purple, then things will start to look more purple. If it's blue, then things will start to look more blue. Whatever your sky color is, or whatever your atmosphere looks like, things blend into the atmosphere as they get further away. This is more like a world lighting type thing, not individual lighting. So not only do you want to make things smaller, you want to fade them into your atmosphere. And this will add a natural sense of depth. Oops. This is one, like, duplicate this. If I moved this back, see how it doesn't feel like it's further away when it's like this? Yeah, it's smaller, but it's not further away. But if you shade it, if you shift the value of it, it'll not only look farther away, but it'll not look small. It'll not look just smaller. It'll be your eye will register it as, your brain will register it as it is a farther away object. And I don't know if I can shift this. No, that's not gonna work. I'd have to redraw a square. But that's something to keep in mind. As things get further away, they get lighter based on whatever color your atmosphere is. Like, this would work regardless of what color I pick. Bum, 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 bum. Layer. Blue. Red. Green. Doesn't really matter. Does that make sense? Do you want me to continue? Anna's really the only one talking, so... Then you would use that principle. Here's some... This would be like a very simple thumbnailing process. But, as you can see, here's your foreground, you have your midground, and your background is back here. Your foregrounds are your darkest values. There's some, like, trees up here, some shadows in the rock, and a character in the midground. This applies basically to everything. No matter how... This is what makes a good piece of art. Keeping these values in mind. And also, the range. Like, this is also where the color, the saturation comes into play. You wouldn't want to... The lightest value in your foreground should not be any lighter than the darkest value in your midground. Like, say your midground's darkest value is this. Hold on. This is your foreground color. Oops. Let me move this up. Foreground color is this right here. So, your darkest value here would be here. You wouldn't really want to get your midground values any higher than, like, for your shading. If I went and put in some light, if I use this color, this is plenty of a difference to do some shading and rim lighting and bring out these forms. My light source is back here, so I'm just kind of doing rim lighting on this part. These are not my thumbnails. I'm using them as examples. They are made by signatures in the corner. Matthew Ware. Back in 2006. They were very contrast, well-made examples, so I'm using them to teach you guys. But see how, and then I would take, this is probably the darkest value for this. See how I'm never getting any lighter than my darkest value on the next, like, depth. The black is your foreground. This darker shade, it fades probably about to here. Like right here. I'll use this to point out name. I forgot I didn't even name the types of the red will be oops. This will be your mid ground. And your blues, this part, is your foreground. This is what's closest to the viewer. My ADD is kicking in, but anyway. That's your foreground. Your darkest values are your foreground. Your midtones are your... I don't know the correct term, but it's your midground. It's your... I'm not gonna... I can't think of the actual term, but it's your middle tones. It's usually where most of your detail is. Like your midground is usually where all your detail goes. Because it's not hidden in shadow and it's not blown out by the atmosphere. Actually, your detail would probably be about here, because that would be your spiral. That's a terrible spiral. The composition spiral. I don't want to get into that this lesson. We'll talk about that some other time. I mentioned it in Discord already. The golden spiral. Closer into the spiral, the more detail you put into this area. That's also why there's a lot of stuff going on here. And then your background, of course, is here. This is where it starts to fade into your natural light source. Your atmosphere light. That's the 3 layers of a painting. And as I said, you never want to shade. Your lightest point on each of these layers should never be lighter than the darkest point on the next. Value-wise. So let's say I wanted to use something like this. Even when it's one color, because your values are different, it's adding the color shows you like this reflects the light source. I'm drawing a blank, sorry. But that applies to everything, like all scenes, landscapes, even when you just are drawing a character, especially in perspective, you have to keep in mind where is it in the page. Like, is it a foreground? Is it a background? Is part of it in the foreground and part of it in the background? Like, your head could be like the head of a character. Oops, wrong brush. Head of a character could be up here. Wow, that's terrible. Hold on, that brush is huge. Why is it so big? Oh, duh. Cute little dragon. But its head would be closer to your foreground, and its tail would be in the background. So you would naturally actually get lighter, and this tail would be closer to your atmosphere color. It would start mixing with the actual like shade of the atmosphere. So even if you're just like drawing a character, understanding where parts of it is in 3D space will help you decide how to shade the whole thing and give it depth. This is terrible. But anyway. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. You would have this and this one. 100. as it got back, you would get lighter. Oops, that's the wrong layer. I will undo this underneath it. After here. Yeah. Whoa. Oops. This will be darker. There. Atmosphere is green. Wings would start to get a bit more of the green. And tail at the end would fade into more blue here because bit darker because this will be blocking light, so the atmosphere light wouldn't hit it. Same with the underbelly, but I'm not going to worry about that too much. Point is, further back something is, or the more atmospheric light it hits, the darker, just the natural hue would blend with your atmosphere. I hope that makes sense. That's a very bad example, but I mean, poorly drawn example, but it gets the point across. Is there anything else I need to... values, planes, and forms. Highlight. I think that was all that I actually planned for, like... That's basically your fundamentals of lighting and value. Like the bare fundamentals. Are there any questions? Or do you want me to do some samples of something, like a material or something that you're not sure how it would work? Or... Yeah, okay. Like what? Hold on, let me find something. Okay. Retail. Oh, I'm trying to find a good example. Actually, hold on, let me